We are so glad to have you all here today, and we're honored to have our two panelists joining us for this discussion. I'll do some brief introductions. My name is Anika Keswani. I'm the Director of Strategy and Operations for Alliances at Salesforce.org. And my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'll just provide a brief description and I'll ask our panelists to do the same. I'm a woman of South Asian descent. I've got hair length about down to my shoulders, and behind me is a Unite slide background for today's event. It's bright and white. We have with us today Kat Holmes. Kat is the Senior Vice President. Sorry, I just lost my script. At Salesforce of Product Design and User Experience. And she's based in the Bay Area. And Kat, I'll ask you to share your pronouns and a brief description as well.
Yeah. Good. Hello. Whatever time in the world we're at, welcome, and thank you so much for having me here today. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an Asian presenting mixed race woman with black hair and green eyes. I'm wearing a black shirt and my favorite 3D printed hoop earrings today. And I'm joining you from my office, actually a little bit north, Anika, in the occupied Salish land, also referred to as Seattle in the Pacific Northwest of the US.
Thank you, Kat. We also have with us Sandra Leung. Sandy is the EVP and General Counsel at Bristol Myers Squibb. She's also a member of the Board of Directors of the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, which we'll be referring today as AALDEF. Sandy, if you could introduce us as well with your pronouns and background.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to this terrific event. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And to describe myself, I am a first-generation Chinese American. My parents were immigrants to the U.S. And I am participating in this call today from my older son's former bedroom in our house in Connecticut. But what you see in the background is Capri, which is the last vacation we took pre-pandemic. So I'm constantly flipping through my phone trying to find old travel photos because I miss traveling tremendously and can't wait to do it again.
I think so many of us join you in that, Sandy. Just dreaming about travel and looking at your background makes me love to go to Italy. Well, we feel that today's fireside chat topic is very timely. A recent survey published by NPR shows that 80% of Asian Americans have felt discriminated against in the US. There is so much to discuss behind this number, how it relates to our organizations, and what actions we can take. So let's dive in. Since we unfortunately have a time constraint, and we know that Sandy has to leave us at the top of the hour, I'd like to start with you, Sandy. Could you tell us a little bit about AALDEF and your motivation for joining the board to get more involved with them?
Sure, thanks very much. The Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, or AALDEF, is a national organization founded in 1974 to protect the civil rights of Asian Americans. AALDEF is focused on economic justice, immigrant rights, housing and environmental justice, educational equity, and voting rights and democracy. One issue that has come up repeatedly throughout our long history has been hate violence. For example, in 1975, we represented Chinese Americans arrested in protest against police brutality in Manhattan's Chinatown and organized a rally to support bystander Peter Yu, who was beaten by the police after complaining about the mishandling of a minor traffic stop. In 1982, we were part of a national campaign to secure justice for Vincent Chin, the Chinese American who was beaten to death in Detroit by two unemployed white auto workers. And in 1987, we represented Dr. Kaushal Sharan, one of several South Asians attacked in New Jersey by a hate group called the Dot Busters. And then we advocated for the passage of New Jersey's hate crimes law. And in 2001, we represented South Asians, Sikhs, and Muslims who were targets of post 9/11 hate violence, racial harassment, and religious profiling. And in 2000 and 2021, we provided assistance to Asian Americans of all ethnic and immigrant backgrounds who've been blamed for COVID-19 and targeted for hate violence, harassment, and discrimination. We provide legal assistance and direct assistance to victims of anti-Asian violence and harassment. And we also provide community education and training and help individual victims secure justice. And we urge people to report hate crimes. We also work for reforms so that all of us someday can live in a world without hate, violence, or discrimination. I've admired the work of AALDEF since I learned of it when I was in college, which was many years ago, and it inspired me to become politically active. When I was in law school, I invited Stan Mark, an AALDEF attorney, to speak to us about a key topic at that time, and that was redress and reparations for Japanese Americans who were forcibly sent to relocation camps during World War II, pursuant to President Eisenhower's Executive Order 9066. I was absolutely thrilled to join AALDEF's board in 2010, as it was an opportunity for me to reinvigorate my sense of activism and giving back to the Asian American community. And that's something that I had set aside for many years as I focused on my career and raising my family. So I'm really proud to be part of AALDEF's board today.
Thank you, Sandy. We're excited to continue to learn more about AALDEF's mission and the amazing work that the organization is doing. And I know we have a couple of folks listening in from AALDEF as well. So thank you for being here and sharing that perspective. So we sit here as a panel of women who identify as Asian in America, but we represent a very small slice of our communities. Can you tell us more about the challenges and the continued impact of stereotypes that we and women in this community face?
Sure. If I could speak first specifically about Asian American women, and I could talk about Asian stereotypes more broadly later. Asian American women have been stereotyped into extremes. We've been viewed as the so-called lotus blossom stereotype, or we're viewed as being quiet, subservient, eager to please. And then there's also the dragon lady stereotype, where we're deceitful, domineering, and mysterious. Asian American women have also been hypersexualized and fetishized as prostitutes and sexually erotic caricatures. And the media reinforces this with characters in movies such as in Full Metal Jacket. Although that movie, Full Metal Jacket, debuted in 1987, and those who are familiar with it know it is a movie about the Vietnam War. Even though it debuted in 1987, Asian women today are still taunted by words spoken by a Vietnamese prostitute character in that movie to American GIs, where she said words to the effect of "me so horny, me love you long time." And I can't count the number of times that I, my sisters, my friends have been, those words have been spoken to us while we're walking in the street or some other context. Asian men, on the other hand, have been desexualized by caricatures in movies such as in 16 Candles. Unfortunately, it's these stereotypes of Asian women that have contributed to the murder of the 6 Asian women in Atlanta earlier this year. And the statement made by the deputy spokesperson of the police at that time, the police department at that time, that the murder had a bad day and felt that he was eliminating a temptation. These stereotypes contribute to the experiences of Asian American women of marginalization, invisibility, and oppression. Asian American women face both subtle and blatant discrimination in their personal relationships and their professional lives, from bosses, professors, colleagues, subordinates, partners, family, and friends. So those are just some broad stereotypes and of Asian American women and the impact that it's had.
There's so much to unpack there, and there's so much that's troubling about all of the ways in which we are portrayed and seen. Kat, I'd love your perspective on the same question. Can you kind of chime in here?
Yeah, hey, Sandy has such a rich amount of history that I think every time I listen to her talk and I pick up another piece of the history of really often undiscussed areas of conflict, marginalization. I know that many of us experience these in our daily life, but to understand the history, I think, is so important in that context. I think really is important to shaping our conversation today. So thank you, Sandy, for that. You know, from a personal standpoint, I think about Asian American women, and Asian women is some of the strongest, certainly in my life, influences in some amazing transformative grit and forging new opportunities and businesses. And my own grandmother came to the United States from Tahiti, her heritage originally from China, and came to the United States during the Chinese Exclusion Act. Again, thinking about the history of the United States in relationship to Asians and Asian Americans. And the Exclusion Act, for Sandy, please correct me if I'm wrong, but for over 40 years, I believe it was, specifically was the first legislation to exclude a specific people by a specific nationality, race, and ethnicity from entering the United States. My family came here during that time. They were detained on Angel Island. During that time, my grandfather and my grandmother's youngest child both died of respiratory illnesses. And my grandmother came into this United States with my father, who was a young child at the time, as a single mother to find her way in making a life for themselves. And they did. She started a business in San Francisco, Chinatown, very much living in poverty for many years. And but then creating also a foundation that became the basis for the privilege that certainly my life has been built upon, and the opportunities that I've had in education and in economic growth. So I think about I think about my grandmother when I hear about the stories every day that we're seeing, Atlanta in particular, but thinking about that narrative that often is not told in the mix of all the kind of exoticizing and perpetual foreigner stereotypes that we see, and particularly surrounding Asian and Asian American women. In my own experience in the workplace, I think there's a unique and important conversation, and I know we'll talk about the workplace a little bit more in a moment, Anika, but specifically around the Asian and female and Asian woman experience and in the workplace. I think in one way we often talk about Asian as a big monolith, like it's a monolith that has so many nuances of ethnic groups and nationalities within it. And I rarely see a company having a nuanced and mature conversation about that diversity just within the category that we might call Asian or Asian American. I think specifically as an Asian American woman, I've found that there are many rooms, especially as I've become more senior in my career, where I'm the only woman, I'm the only woman of color, and I'm the only Asian woman. And it really hit me hard in the company that I was working in prior to Salesforce. I worked at Microsoft for a while, but we were in a diversity, I would call it like a workshop, with over 100 managers in our company. And the conversation turned to Asian American female employees and, how could managers support the growth of more leaders? But right behind that was this conversation about communication style, or I really wish that people would show up with, the women in my team would show up with being more assertive or more opinionated. And all of these layers of stereotypes started to come through in a really sharp focus. And I don't know how many folks today may have experienced this, but the facilitator of the conversation turned to me and said, well, Kat, as an Asian American woman, what's your experience been? And that for me really crystallized a lot of the loneliness. Not only did I feel put on the spot, was not at all a safe environment to talk about my experiences. So that was uncool, massively uncool, but also just put into sharp light how little time we spend talking about specifically the experiences of Asian American women and Asian women in the workplace. And kind of get folded between talking about Asian as a monolithic group and then talking about women as a monolithic group. So there's a unique conversation to have, I guess. And I've been working for myself and on my own kind of relationships to these conversations to try to find ways to raise this more often in the workplace with my teams, because there is a lens that if we don't do that, people end up feeling very alone, isolated, and unsupported. And that carries its own kind of exhaustion in the workplace over time. So.
You bring up some great points, and Kat, I couldn't agree more with your point about understanding the history. I mean, I grew up in Texas, and learning and understanding the history of discrimination against Asians and Asians in America, that wasn't in the textbooks. That was something you had to seek out. That was something you had to find out from your parents and your grandparents and hear their stories and share their stories. And I think it's so powerful that we can now do that and feel safe doing that with each other and publicly. And it's so important because how else will we learn? So kind of piggybacking onto that a little bit and talking about bringing it up in the workplace and talking about it, being more vocal now, what do you think is different? And Sandy, I'll start with you for this. What do you think is different now? Why are we now starting to talk about it? And why haven't we been talking about it up to this point? What do you think was the tipping point?
Well, I certainly think that the recent uptick in anti-Asian violence, and make no mistake, there is a long history of anti-Asian violence in the US brought on by government regulation or by individual acts of violence by mobs or individuals. I think that that has put Asians, the issues that Asians face, whether it is by viewing as a model minority or other stereotypes, have become more to the center. I also think that because of the recent incidents, people are challenging the model minority stereotype, wondering if it's true, and more Asians are speaking up. I've never seen Asians in my own company, Bristol Myers Squibb, speaking more openly about their personal and painful experiences where they felt isolated, where they felt invisible, where they felt that people just marginalized them because they thought they didn't have any issues at all. Even to the point where people were very hurt that none of their colleagues reached out to them in light of all the overt acts of violence, numerous overt acts of violence against Asians. No one called them to check in to say, how are you doing? And when you talk to folks and ask them, well, why didn't you reach out? They would say, you know, I didn't think there were any problems. I thought that you were fine. You always seemed to be so calm and stoic. I never had any idea that this was impacting you that way. So I think people are much more open to speaking of these issues now, much more recently because of what we're reading about in the media and what we're experiencing with the AAPI hate brought on by concerns about the coronavirus and brought on by some of the reckless rhetoric by frankly, some politicians and other prominent people in this country.
Thanks for that perspective. Kat, what do you think about this idea of why we're talking about it now? Do you feel there's a different sense of space or a different sense of ability to speak openly?
I definitely echo what Sandy's mentioned about there's I'd say a rising number of folks reaching out to one another within the workplace. Certainly I've seen an increase, and to talk through experiences that they've encountered maybe even years ago, but there's now a reaching out that I didn't see at a level before. I think, you know, as we mark the 1 year kind of point in time since the murder of George Floyd, I think that really sparked a shift, certainly like just broader socially, in awareness and conversations of the systemic racism that permeates the United States for sure, but as we think more broadly, as many conversations to have around the impact of systemic racism. And in that, I think, you know, looking at within the workplace, certainly in my own experience, the communities, the Black community in particular, at Salesforce has done an amazing job in creating spaces and conversations for people to show up and share their experiences, just as a practice inside of the workplace, and to have hard conversations in a safe environment with leadership at our most senior levels present in that conversation, to listen and learn, and to own that we don't know until we take the space and time to listen. And so I do see a huge shift in how Black Lives Matters and the Black communities inside of companies have created a shift in that needing of space, that making of space. And in that certainly is people from all backgrounds participating in these conversations. But as we then are seeing, the spikes in violence and hateful acts against Asian Americans and Asians, there's a question then right on the heels of that of, okay, how do we kind of follow that path of creating space, listening, learning what we don't know. And in that, I think a lot of people are reckoning with experiences they've had in a way that could be a very large group conversation for those who are comfortable, but also finding ways to create small group conversations, more focused. Again, if we're talking about Asian American women, people are trans and Asian, there's smaller groups and intersections of experiences that we must honor and create space for conversations in safe ways that people feel like they can show up. So I'm incredibly proud to be a part of a company where the communities are creating that space where there's leadership, support, and showing up and participating in those conversations at the most senior levels. And I know that that's been part of the culture of many companies, and in some companies it's still, or organizations, it's still a new idea. But I see the difference that it's making in bringing support for one another and addressing that loneliness or that feeling of being the only one. And if anything else, the chance to connect with others who have a shared experience in a way. And we find that it may not be limited to our own race, gender, or experience group. We may find more connections and opportunities for solidarity across those definitions and identities. So that's something that I see in the workplace that I really hope for, with how much time we spend in our organizations. The communities of coworkers have become some of our primary communities during the pandemic. You know, this is where I spend most of my day, here with my head in this box, connected with all of my coworkers and colleagues, to create space to have those kind of conversations about those aspects of us that are deeply human. I think is an incredibly healing and healthy thing to do.
That's a great point. And I want to dig a little bit deeper. A little later on, we'll dig into what those safe spaces can look like and how do we create those. There are so many different ways you can, and ways that you can execute that successfully. But I love that perspective on, you're right, we're on screen all the time. We need to support each other in the ways that where we are and find out where that is and participate that way. You both brought up a point a little bit about the allyship and solidarity, and I wanted to dig a little bit into that first. Sandy, can you help us look a little bit back at the history of communities working together and how that's evolved to where and how different communities have historically supported each other in the space?
Sure, and if I could speak particularly about Asian and Black communities. Asian and Black communities' histories have always been intertwined. Their fight for civil rights have always been connected. And there have been countless examples of powerful and moving coalitions between Asian and Black communities in the last 200 years that have led to major leaps forward in racial justice. For example, the abolitionist Frederick Douglass opposed the restriction on Chinese immigration in the 1800s. And we talked briefly earlier about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So Frederick Douglass was one of the first, most prominent people, an African American, to talk about, to speak out against the Chinese Exclusion Act and restriction on immigration. He advocated for much freer immigration to the US. I'd also point out that two Asian American women activists, Grace Lee Boggs and Yuri Kochiyama, were heavily involved in the activism in the Black civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. In fact, Yuri Kochiyama was a close friend of Malcolm X. And so the Asian American civil rights movement has benefited from the Black civil rights movement. And so the two have really been intertwined. And so I just briefly, that's sort of the history. I haven't gotten to a lot of detail because of time restrictions, but there are many, many examples in history of Blacks and Asians working together to support civil rights. And I could also speak a little bit now or later, Anika, about the court system, how Asians use the court system and African Americans too, and how that's helped both. But however you'd like to address it, we could talk about that a little bit later.
I'd like to dive into that now since we only have 5 minutes left with you. Let's make the most of it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So Asian Americans have historically fought back against injustices, the US court systems, and to vindicate their rights. And those cases have advanced civil rights for all Americans. For example, in the Yik-Wo versus Hopkins case, the US Supreme Court struck down an ordinance in San Francisco that prohibited laundries from operating in wooden buildings without permits. At that time, most Chinese laundries were in wooden buildings. And when those owners applied for permits, all of them were denied, whereas only one white person was denied a permit. So Yik-Wo continued to operate his laundry without the necessary permit, and he was convicted for violating the ordinance, and the permit was about $10, but he couldn't get it. So he took his case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Yik-Wo decision was the first Supreme Court case that used the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment holding that laws with discriminatory intent were unconstitutional. And that case has been cited over 150 times in civil rights cases. That has benefited many folks. Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minoru Yatsui all litigated cases before the US Supreme Court arising from their internment in relocation camps during World War II. And most recently, and in fact, on May 19th of this year, President Biden signed into law the COVID-19 hate crimes bill that was sponsored by Mazie Hirono in the Senate and Grace Meng in the House. Most prominently, the bill will supplement the federal government's effort to address the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes during the pandemic, and it'll establish a point person at the Justice Department who will quickly review hate crimes incidents and provide more guidance to state and local entities to make it easier to report hate crimes. And the bill will also expand public education campaigns designed to increase awareness and outreach to victims. So that's just a very brief history of the use of litigation that Asians have used that have benefited many oppressed people in their fight for civil rights.
Thanks for that perspective, Sandy. I think that we had talked about this in our previous sessions together, of just this concept of being more vocal, fighting back, working together, and working together with our other communities as allies towards that end. So it's really inspiring to see how that's continued and evolved into the hate crimes bill, and will continue to going forward. Does anyone have any questions? I'm just checking the chat to see if there are any questions for Sandy before she has to leave. Otherwise, I'll continue down the question path. All right, great.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me, and my apologies that I have to leave. I have a conflict, but it's been a pleasure to see you. I'm so impressed by Salesforce. You guys are so organized and so progressive in hosting these series of programs. So thank you very much. It's really been my pleasure.
Thank you, Sandy. We so appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to learning more about AALDEF. We actually have a slide that we wanted to share before you drop off. So that if people would like to check out resources, learn a little bit more about AALDEF, they can have a look on the AALDEF website. And if you want to get involved, there are many ways that you can find ways to. You can go to the Learn More link and just click through. So we're so grateful for her time. So let's jump back in, Kat. Now that it's you and me, we've got a couple of questions that are a little bit more tactical and a little bit more around how do we create these spaces. And I wanted to dig in first to partly in your experience with your team and how you're checking in with your team and helping them process what's happening, and then bring that back to the Salesforce perspective of what you've found here and other places that have worked to create these spaces for employees to connect and to help lift each other up or manage.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're asking that, because I'm learning all the time, and I think we're learning. Certainly no single playbook for showing up for each other in the workplace in these times. I think we have gained a lot of experience this year collectively, but sharing that experience is what I think is going to really help us grow and be stronger at this in the future. I think, in combination of, as I'm visibly female, visibly a woman, and I'm visibly Asian. Since my very first day in any job, one of the amazing experiences I have is people will reach out to me to share or let me know kind of what their experiences are. And I hear a really wide range in every job I go to. And, from I had an experience, it seems like maybe this is something that impacted my career. I don't know if this was related to my gender or my race. I want to talk to somebody about it. Or I enjoy seeing a leader who I can relate to or who looks like me, right? And I feel like represented by and that it represents a potential future growth path. I think in those conversations, I think many of us experience that kind of connection from other, especially up and coming and rising young leaders. Not knowing is, and not pretending to know, like owning that I do not know, is maybe the most effective leadership skill I could advise in these situations. So it's the constant practice that I'm in, that we're all in figuring out what it means to be a leader in these changing conversations, these very personal, sometimes conversations, starting with I don't know, and then asking a lot of questions of our rising and young leaders who are finding their own way. And often I find so much and gain so much perspective from just listening. In the design of our teams and our environment, one thing that my leadership team does that I learned from them is every team meeting, we start with a section of time just dedicated to appreciation, acknowledgement, and apologies. And as a practice and as a muscle, as a team, to, even if not all of those happen in public, but sometimes it happens in private, it creates the space, and as leaders, we can model for our teams what it looks like to own and apologize and acknowledge in the moment just the things that are happening in our days. And it's served us really well as a team in our culture as the world continues to bring one conversation after another. There are hard conversations to have, but important and necessary to create space for people to process through and experience, share their experiences. When I think about the design of conversations, and one of the things that I think is, again, listening to Sandy talking about the detail and the depth, the history, but the hate crimes bill that was just signed into law, I also love that it has a clause for language, as a clause for specifying specifically the education and then also the reporting of hate crimes being available in multiple languages. And that itself, I think, is a huge design choice that has been omitted. It's something that has led to exclusionary processes over years because we just didn't take the time to make it available to the many different languages in the Asian community for reporting. So in the same way, when I think about language in the workplace, are we thinking about the diversity of international experiences and languages that should be represented in our conversations, the space for people to interact and engage in multiple languages. And then also how we, when we get together, creating some ground rules around these conversations where some spaces are purely for sharing experiences and there's no feedback to be given, there's no fixing to be done, it's just holding space. And in that, people kind of know they can come into that space and that's the intent and experience they can have. And then we also have a really amazing team led by Jacqueline Chapman at Salesforce that leads what we call the warm line. This is a place where, kind of similar as I mentioned, an employee might have a question of, there's something that happened, it didn't feel quite right. It's not, I don't want to start first with, a escalation from an HR perspective. I want to have a conversation with somebody about my experience. The warm line is open to people of color and women in particular, to talk to someone about the experience they had and to kind of think through together what their choices are in terms of opportunity resolution and in different ways. So those kind of programs are just, seeing those working together in very private ways, but also in very public ways, so that we can model the behavior that we want for our culture and our communities. I've worked together almost intentionally as a designer. I think of it almost like intentional design. So there's many ways for people to participate in conversations about their experiences and to receive resources and connect to other people in the process.
I think that's one of the many of the things that you described actually make Salesforce a particularly special place to work because of those spaces. I think you mentioned this earlier. There are a lot of organizations that provide these types of resources, but there also aren't. And there's a lot that we can learn from what's worked and well, and maybe what hasn't worked well here. I think to your point about the warm line, what's neat about that, it sounds like it's almost like a safe space one-on-one, right? Where you can speak to somebody that is not involved, that wouldn't know, but that also isn't somebody who could put something at risk. And so it can completely feel safe to the people who are calling in, which I think that's really special. Mm-hmm. It's, I think, also really important that leaders of the company, like yourself and others, stand behind these things. Have you seen that be a big part of creating these spaces in your area of the business and in other areas at Salesforce where it's leader driven and it's from the ground up, it kind of comes from both sides? Yeah,
I think, and I could imagine for many of the people joining here today, been asking myself a lot about, like, what does courageous leadership in these moments look like courageous conversations. Again, there's no roadmap, certainly in the kind of workplaces that we all work in, on how to do this, but there's great models of leadership in community building practices and in racial solidarity work, in justice work, that like there's leadership examples, often from outside, certainly the corporate paradigms, where we can draw sources of guidance and leading ways to lead in these moments. I think for me, and I've been asked several times, why in particular am I so drawn to conversations around inclusion and equity? And I'm a product leader. I work on product design. I choose to work at the heart of the places where we do engineering and design, but I want to bring with that all of that expertise that I'm learning and sharing with, in terms of inclusive leadership and courageous practices for equity and inclusion in the workplace. I think that, being in a position of leadership power, certainly taking responsibility is something I've taken to heart, and the influence that I can have in creating an environment that supports other leaders showing up in that way, supports people at all different roles and all different kind of ways of contributing to the company, that they can show up in different ways. And so much of that for me comes back to experiences I've had with exclusion, and hard experiences I've had in my life. And as I've looked at that, and I'd imagine many of us could kind of look back on the moments that impacted us and shaped us as leaders. For me, there were places where I really needed an adult in the room to speak up for something that had happened. I certainly had encounters with racism early in my life, but the things that really stuck with me are the moments where there was no adult or no leader standing up and being willing to say, that's not okay, I won't stand for it, I'm here with you, and we're going to stand against that. And I think that's shaped how I think about leadership in the workplace. I think I've chosen to be a company where I feel well supported in doing that kind of leadership work, to be able to say, it's not okay, I stand with you in standing against these experiences and this kind of hate. And that I'm committed to finding better ways forward and really getting into it and understanding what the design of that might look like. I think as leaders, there's 3 things that I'm committed to, in particular, as we talk about Asian Americans and Asian experiences and the rise in violence. Within the workplace, I think first honoring the many different experiences within the category of race that we call Asian, right? There's dozens of unique nationalities and cultures and ethnic groups and identities. So spending time asking people how they want to be represented and asking people what makes them feel seen. I think this helps us learn how to better serve and support these diverse communities. And it's a conversation that I'm learning how to do as an Asian American, how to have these conversations in increasing our understanding of the diversity within any community we might treat as monolithic, and understanding the diversity that exists within. The second thing is hiring, retaining, and promoting and advancing and mentoring Asian and Asian American employees. I think thinking about ways to improve the sense of belonging, the culture of belonging within our teams is really important as leaders, and just partnering with our teams to understand better ways to support the sense of safety and comfort and ability to contribute their best work in our teams. And the third and final thing is, in order to build products that work well, or solutions or experiences that work well for a global audience, we must build products in a way that welcome the contributions of everyone, that represent the diversity of our global audience. So, asking ourselves, where are the places in our product offering or solutions or service offering that might be difficult for somebody to use because they speak a different language than I do, or live in a different culture than I do, or have a different set of abilities than I do. And so as a leader, making that almost a daily practice of asking, where in my hiring processes and my meeting facilitation practices in my thinking about, the shape of my team and the kind of contributions and how I value those contributions. Thinking almost as a daily practice, almost like brushing teeth, of how I can recognize places where I have opportunities to improve.
There's so much to dive deeper in there. Before I do, I wanted to just check with the audience if you have any questions about specifics. So we talked about specific things in companies that can be done and specific areas of the business that we can create, because since all of you in the audience represent organizations that are looking to create these same spaces in your organization, maybe you already have, how can we help and how can we kind of share some learnings? So feel free to post your questions in the chat. I wanted to dig into a couple of things. So first, at the end of this presentation, we'll share a slide with some kind of high-level suggestions based on a little bit of what you talked about, Kat, and a little bit of what Salesforce has done in terms of resources. So what do these programs look like? How do you define employee resource groups? In relation to that, and in relation to something that you said around product design and designing for inclusivity, how does one go about thinking through designing for inclusivity for cultural backgrounds and language backgrounds? How do we even start with that?
I love that question, because it's a really important one to keep exploring. The origins of inclusive design as a practice are in disability, and really emerged in the early 70s as the internet was coming into existence, and it's grown up. Inclusive design's grown up alongside digital experiences and the web, with disability as a kind of first innovator in the space of inclusive design. So thinking about things like closed captioning and audiobooks and online experiences, like all of our mobile phones have at least 20 different types of inclusive design innovations in them. And so as I was working on inclusive design really deeply about 10 years ago for the first time, one of the things that became clear to me, though, is that there's this underlying thread of exclusion. Like, designing for inclusion starts by recognizing exclusion. And through that lens, I think we can take a much wider aperture on what kinds of exclusion people experience with our services, our workplaces, our communities. When I think about exclusion, the way I describe it also comes from a definition rooted in disability. The World Health Organization took a dramatic redefining of disability. They moved towards the social definition in 2001, which is that it's a mismatched interaction between the features of a person's body and the features of the environment in which they live. And I use that as a lens of thinking about exclusion. Where are the places where mismatches occur between the features of our solutions, workplaces, and communities, and the features of a person's experience. And so when we think first and foremost about recognizing exclusion in that way, we can think about the dimensions of language, of behavioral kind of commonplace practices, the way that different colors, hand signals, eye contact is translated and interpreted, and the meaning that it carries across different cultures. And when we understand, we take the time to understand the depth of the many communities that might be experiencing exclusion or a mismatch with our products, it's really about finding and bringing in those perspectives into our design process, into how we think about the experiences we're creating, and making space for people who have experienced that exclusion to lead us to a better solution, right? I see that as much richer than user research, for example. It's really about who are we hiring? How are, the makeup of our teams, the partnerships that we have with communities in ways that that contribution can happen with our design practice in a very meaningful way. So being able to recognize exclusion, but then also shift who we consider an expert in creating a better solution. I think starting often by that exclusion that people experience by culture, by identity, and certainly by ability, all are powerful places, not just to make a more inclusive product, but to really innovate and create solutions that are better for everyone.
That's such a great perspective when you think about it that way, because it allows you to sort of focus in microscope. We had a keynote yesterday with Joe Fairley, who had mentioned something about you need a microscope and you need a telescope. And it sounds like that would apply really well here. You need both because you have to have that detailed view, but without it, the bigger picture of exclusion and where are we starting from and who are we trying to serve here.
I love that. Yeah, I think the microscope and telescope applies really well as we think about data as well. You know, it's a powerful tool that can be misapplied in ways. And I think that microscope and telescope balance is one thing that really helps make sure that we're using data intentionally, responsibly, and ethically, that we're thinking about the impact on, you know, one person, and we're thinking about the impact on large communities as well, and finding the context of both as we think about our decisions will always bring us to a more informed place, a better balanced place.
Yeah, closer every time.
Yeah.
I did have one last question for you. We had a keynote earlier today where we talked a little bit about empathy and how that evolves into compassion. Have you seen that evolution in your experience of, we're all talking about empathy and being empathetic with each other, but the evolution of that into compassion and how that can help drive us to a better understanding of each other?
I unfortunately didn't catch the keynote this morning, so I will in advance say there might be a misalignment with how I communicate this, but at a high level, I love the sentiment, and I will watch the keynote later.
No pressure, of course.
But in the same way, I think empathy, I do see that evolution. I do see that evolution happening. I think it's very important, especially, you know, in the design field for a long time. I'll just use that as one lens. Empathy, and I may overcharacterize it slightly negatively here, so there's a lot of positives, right? But there's a lot of shortcuts that have been offered to empathy. Like as one example, a lot of teams have said, oh, well, let's try to understand the experience of someone who's blind. Let's put on a blindfold and try to use an elevator for 20 minutes. There is no way that is an empathy building exercise, right? But it can be coined as that because there's no way that you truly can understand the lived experience of someone who's blind by simulating or pretending, right? And I think that carries over as well into how we think about empathy more broadly, that there's a shorthand misunderstanding about it being kind of spending a day in your shoes. I now have an understanding of your experience. So I think that's the real risk. I think also empathy is a word that's rooted in Western language and Western culture. And as I've spent time with Asian communities, Asian designers, you know, there isn't a one-to-one translation of empathy as, you know, kind of just you know, in Cantonese, for example, there's not one word that captures what empathy is, but there's multiple expressions of an empathy-like idea. Some of the broader ways of thinking about this, expanding my thinking of empathy, are, you know, what does it mean to understand the total situation in the context of something, in the bigger picture of somebody's experience. Something I've learned through thinking about empathy through the language of Cantonese. Or what does it mean to reason with your heart rather than your mind? There's some translations there that are really, I think, fascinating as well. I think all of that starts to bring us to thinking less about what does it mean to be in somebody else's experience, and more what does it mean to be present as somebody else is having an experience. And that's what I think compassion really captures, is the ability and capacity that we can cultivate in ourselves to be present as somebody else is going through an experience, sharing that experience in a way that they feel seen, in a way that there's space for them to show up as they are. And that practice, I think, is one that anybody can cultivate, but it's very different than a knowing or an assuming of knowing of what somebody else's experience is. So really focusing on our own ability to be present and hold space for one another, and all of the really wide range of hard, challenging, and also really positive and beautiful experiences that people have. I think that's compassion.
I think that ties so nicely early into what we discussed earlier too, about creating these spaces and doing that with that compassion lens of, if we're not part of that community, we're part of the creating of the safe space, of that space that allows people to feel comfortable and safe. And I think that we've talked about so many really important lessons that can be taken away to organizations looking to do this themselves. I wanted to say thank you so much, Kat. I can't thank you enough really for your participation today. It's really an honor to have you here. And there's a lot of really important things that we were able to discuss.
You did. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. And I think we covered a lot in a brief period of time. So thank you so much for the rich set of questions and an opportunity to reflect on these ways that we're all growing.
Yeah, that's a great description. We don't have any questions from the chat, but I did want to just briefly offer up this slide around AALDEF again, if you'd like more information about it. And we also have a slide that will show some resources. So if you'd like to set up something like what Salesforce has set up, or take some lessons that we've created and shared and build your own version of that, we have at Salesforce, we have an employee relations and employee success organization where employees can be directed to work with employee success business partners. They can learn about harassment and discrimination policies. This is kind of the foundation, right? We then, at Salesforce, we have an employee assistance program. And I think this can feed into something like the warm line that Kat described, where it's meant to be a space that isn't HR, it's somebody else that is meant to assist employees one-on-one and be a place they can go if they're not sure where to go and they don't want to talk to a peer or a manager. There's also the next level up is employee resource groups, which I've been at Salesforce for 14 years now. And back at the very early days, we didn't have these. They evolved. They slowly became part of the fabric of the company. They were created and they're available as great resources for employees. I've seen these successfully at other companies with tactical backing of executive sponsorship from the top down, but also from the bottom up of peer participation and really creating spaces for people to take on leadership roles and drive these missions forward. And where they're prioritized, there's a budget behind them. There's real substance behind their existence as well. And that really helps it be important. So thank you again. I really appreciate your joining us. Please stay tuned for the recording and share it with your networks. We talked a lot about inclusive design, checking in, prioritizing employee resources, lots of great information as well about the history and how we can all get involved to help create these spaces for each other. So thanks again and enjoy the rest of the summit, everyone.